Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer. In the 1970s, my family, myself included, were very involved in the beginning of the anti-abortion movement, or at least the Protestant wing of that, with my father, Francis Schaefer, collaborating with Dr. Siebert Koop, who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General, to make a very well-known film series called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with a book companion. And that really was the beginning of the fundamentalist evangelical assault on women in this country that ended just a little while ago with Roe v. Wade being overturned by the predominantly Roman Catholic right-wing Republican-appointed Supreme Court. But of course, this story does not end there. And the extremism of the anti-abortion movement has just grown and multiplied. For instance, in Texas, there's now a plan to punish prosecutors who don't fall in line and prosecute people for abortion crimes, whether that's women who have had abortions or doctors and nurses or people who transport them across state lines to have abortions. For instance, an activist, an anti-abortion activist by the name of Mark Lee Dixon has been traveling around Texas talking various town councils and cities and towns into passing laws that make it illegal to use any roads that go through their jurisdiction to transport a woman out of state to have an abortion. So maybe her mother-in-law takes her to a state where she can have an abortion or gets in a car to go there. And they're calling this abortion trafficking. And as the Washington Post put it, they described this as an act of helping any pregnant woman cross state lines to end her pregnancy, lending her a ride, funding, or another form of transport, while the term trafficking typically refers to people who are forced, tricked, or coerced. Dixon's definition applies to all people seeking abortions because, as he puts it, the unborn child is always taken against his will, end quote. When you think of Texas, this state where people carry weapons, where so many people are armed, where the level of gun violence is so high and the level of gun suicide is so high, to describe this state as somehow pro-life just seems a little ironic, to put it mildly. But when you combine the level of gun carrying and violence and the vigilantism of a law that seeks to find and stop and prosecute a mother-in-law for taking her daughter-in-law, or a mom for taking her daughter, or a friend for taking a friend in her car to drive for a few hours across state line to have an abortion, perhaps take a 13-year-old little girl who's been raped by her father across state lines to have an abortion, and picture that 13-year-old little girl sitting in the back seat with a seatbelt and the mom trying to drive her to have an abortion somewhere. And the scene when that car is stopped, because this law enables neighbors and friends, passersby, anyone is enforced to prosecute this law. Of course, they will be carrying guns, these right-wing fanatics. So I can picture a mom rolling her window down as someone flags her car down, brandishing a firearm, saying, "Is that girl next to you, the one in the back seat, is she pregnant? Get out of the car, ma'am," at gunpoint. How else would you enforce this? Texas is really emerging as an outlier on the fanaticism and extremism of both the cult of guns, the cult of violence, stockpiling weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition to stand against your government, QAnon conspiracy rife people who believe that Donald Trump was robbed of the presidency, send all kinds of people to the Capitol to storm it January 6th. This same state now has a Senate bill that forbids prosecutors from adopting a policy of refusing to prosecute women and doctors, certain crimes such as abortion cases. Under the new law, these policies will constitute official misconduct and could lead to prosecutors being removed from office or even imprisoned. And then you have activists crisscrossing the state. So far, they've signed up about 50 localities to either pass their laws locally or look into passing them, with many more on the way, criminalizing giving someone a ride to an abortion clinic outside of the state, whether that's a relative or a husband, a nurse, a doctor, a friend, a mother-in-law, a teacher helping a child who's been raped, or anyone else. I picture a mom who is carrying a pregnancy where the child is going to die within an hour or two of birth, or perhaps even kill the mother. And these cases have become very hard to find someone to do an abortion for, even where technically they're legal in the state. Will that pregnant mom be standing by a roadside with a gun pointed at her head by some vigilante? It's so typical that it's these men involved traveling like old circuit preachers from town to town, trying to sign them up to persecute and prosecute women, to persecute and prosecute the state's official prosecutors, who so far have tried, because of their good sense, not to prosecute women or put doctors in jail. Where will this end? Where will this vigilante justice end in this swaggering, gun-carrying, male-dominated, misogynistic hellhole we call Texas? You know, back in the day, my father, Francis Schaeffer, when he theorized on his reasons for being against abortion, and I, as his nepotistic sidekick in my 20s, went along and helped him make these movies. For us, it was kind of a theoretical question, and the Supreme Court and the trend of the country towards women's liberation seemed unstoppable, and we were very stupid in what we started, and very wrong and evil. And it is a deep regret of my life. But even in our deepest moment of ridiculous self-righteous passion against women and against the right to choose, I don't think we could have foreseen a day where Texans with guns drawn would be approaching women in cars demanding to see proof that they weren't pregnant. You think that's far-fetched? How else would this be enforced? What we're on the cusp of is armed vigilante justice against girls and women and rape victims in Texas. For what? Not even for getting an abortion, for getting in a car with a relative, a friend, a pastor perhaps, a nurse. You think that's far-fetched? There are many cases like that, in that abusive subculture. And this child is hauled out of her car, 13, 14 years old, at gunpoint. How else would that be enforced? How would you find out who they were? Ratted out by a neighbor who's free to sue them? What are we going to be doing? Putting up roadblocks and checking women like the Sandinistas in Nicaragua used to do in their revolution? Or ISIS did, hauling women out of cars, or the morality police who beat and rape women in police stations? Is that how we're going to punish a friend who gives someone a ride for an abortion? Is this what we're coming to? Are these good God-fearing folks taking a page from the morality police in Iran, head coverings, transporting someone for an abortion? The blur and the noise of this global movement of misogyny, pushing back against everything from women winning soccer tournaments and worldwide events where women athletes are taken seriously and still groped and shoved around, kissed without permission. I'm a 71-year-old white privileged male, and I come from a background that shamefully was on the side of these abusers at one time, but I've spent the last 40 years doing what I can to apologize by being an activist on the other side of the issue. A side that is pro-decency, pro-freedom, pro-woman, pro-choice. And I am disgusted by the state of Texas and this pincer movement of closing in to force prosecutors to put women in prison and doctors in prison and get neighbors to rat out other neighbors, gun-toting fools, ratting out people in Jesus' name. Is this what we will come to? Well, I have a solution for this. Never vote for another Republican for the rest of your life. This party is the party of the abuse of women. period. The Republicans are abusers of women, period. There is no other way to interpret this movement. At its extreme, it shows up what the more moderate, quote, pro-life position leads to. There is no halfway measure. Either women have choice and freedom and dignity, or we paw through their underwear drawer like good old-fashioned perverts looking for evidence of malfeasance. What kind of people live in Texas? I'm 71 years old, so I was alive when the communists were doing their thing in the Soviet Union, and Mao Zedong was still alive, and McCarthy too in the 1950s. McCarthyism and the whole anti-communist drive. You know, a hallmark of all ideological horror is when you start gunning for the fellow traveler. So Stalin not only shot you if you were anti-communist, he killed your mother and dad or went after your friends. Mao Zedong did the same thing. McCarthy, you know, the hearings, you know, were you or have you ever been a communist, whatever, and then like talk to somebody in the family. This whole horror in Texas, this vigilante justice by these right-wing fanatics smacks of that. We're not just going to prosecute a woman who has an abortion or her doctor, or force our prosecutors to prosecute as that law does. We're going to come after you if you even help her. This is fellow traveler shit. This is what the Chinese dynasties did when they would execute to the first and second degree, not just the person you're after, but their family and their family's friends. This is real tyranny. And to have the Republican Party in bed with this sort of nonsense of going after, quote, fellow travelers, this is just Stalinism, McCarthyism, communist Chinese Communist Party. If you're a friend of someone in Hong Kong who demonstrates against the Chinese government, then they're going to arrest you too. This kind of widening circle of Republican right-wing fascist tyranny has to be stopped. Just a thought. My name is Frank Schaeffer.